The night glittered with chandeliers and the smell of expensive wine. A gathering of the richest and most influential figures who strutted through the marble halls of the billionaire family's mansion as though they owned the very air. It was meant to be a celebration, a party of exclusivity where only the right kind of people were welcome. But the moment she walked in elegant, powerful, yet undeniably different, the atmosphere shifted like a storm rolling across calm skies. Eyes followed her, whispers spread like wildfire, and before long, laughter slithered through the crowd, sharp and calculated, the kind of laughter meant to wound. They saw not her brilliance, not the billions she had built from grit and genius, but only the color of her skin. Behind manicured smiles and designer gowns, the racism was unmasked, raw and deliberate. Some muttered if she had mistaken the entrance. Others chuckled about whether she had come to serve instead of to sit. To them, she was an uninvited shadow crossing their shining world. Someone whose presence alone disrupted the perfect picture of white wealth and control. The family themselves, who had long prided their empire on keeping neighborhoods clean through ruthless HOA rules that drove black families out with endless fines and harassment, watched her with smug confidence, as though this humiliation was their sport, their way of reminding her where she belonged. But beneath the sneers and the subtle cruelty, a truth lingered. Unseen by them but burning in her chest, she wasn't there to beg for their acceptance. She wasn't there to be their entertainment. She carried with her the key to a $5 billion deal that would decide the future of their empire. And though they laughed, though they mocked, though they paraded their prejudice openly in their golden cage, every insult they cast was tightening a noose around their own legacy. They thought the night belonged to them, but the reckoning had already begun the moment she stepped into their world. Silent, steady, and ready to show them that racism, no matter how powerful it pretends to be, always sows the seeds of its own destruction. She had been born far from glittering mansions and billion-dollar contracts. Raised in a neighborhood where cracked sidewalks carried stories of struggle. Where her mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on, and where the weight of prejudice pressed on every corner like an invisible chain. Yet from those very streets, she carved a future brighter than anyone could have imagined. By the time she was 35, she had built a global company that merged technology and sustainability, employing thousands of people worldwide, creating opportunities where others saw none, and gaining a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in international business. Still, despite her accomplishments, she carried the scars of racism. The years of being underestimated, belittled, and dismissed because of the color of her skin. She knew the look in their eyes before they even opened their mouths, the doubt, the smirk, the subtle refusal to see her as equal. That night, the invitation she accepted wasn't for pleasure, but business. A negotiation with one of the oldest and richest white families in the country, a dynasty that had grown its wealth through oil, real estate, and exploitation masked as progress. They lived in gated communities where black families were fined for the slightest violations. Their HOA weaponized like a shield to keep their neighborhoods polished and exclusive, driving out anyone they deemed unfit. To them, wealth wasn't just about money, it was about control, about dominance, about reminding those who didn't look like them that even success had boundaries when race came into play. And now, this family needed her, though they didn't know it yet. The $5 billion deal at stake was their lifeline, a partnership that would rescue their empire from decline. Yet when she walked into their mansion that night, their arrogance blinded them to the reality that the balance of power had shifted. They saw only what their prejudice allowed, a black woman daring to stand among them, a presence that disrupted the illusion of their superiority. The room smelled of aged cigars and expensive perfume, filled with men in tailored suits and women in gowns glittering with diamonds, each one a reflection of inherited privilege. And she could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her back as she moved gracefully through the crowd. Memories flooded her grandmother telling her stories of segregated schools. Her father denied loans to start his business. Her brother pulled over countless times simply for driving the wrong kind of car in the wrong neighborhood. Each moment of injustice, each cut of racism, had built in her a resilience sharper than steel. And as she approached the family at the center of the empire, she saw the smirks, heard the mocking whispers, and recognized the same poison dressed in tuxedos and champagne glasses. The setup was almost cinematic. On one side, a dynasty of white wealth, bound by arrogance and hate; on the other, a black woman who carried not only the strength of her own fight, but the weight of generations before her. Every insult tossed her way, every cold glance, every hushed laugh, was fuel, stoking a fire she had long learnt to control, and though they thought they were mocking her, they were unknowingly sealing their own fate. For she wasn't there to blend in, nor to seek approval. She was there to decide, quietly and deliberately, whether this family's empire would stand or fall. And that decision, though unknown to them, was already tilting toward a storm that would expose the cost of their racism in the harshest light. The evening unfolded with a dangerous elegance, every chandelier-lit corner of the mansion echoing with laughter that hid sharpened edges, every champagne glass raised with a toast that carried undertones of dismissal, and every glance reminding her she was in enemy territory, dressed in silk and poise. They had invited her because her company's technology was the future. The lifeline their decaying empire needed to remain relevant in a shifting economy. Yet they treated her as though she were a curiosity that had wandered into their world uninvited, a spectacle rather than a partner. She heard their whispers behind manicured hands, their mockery of her hair, their laughter about how she must have gotten lucky, their thinly veiled disbelief that someone like her could sit at the head of billion-dollar negotiations. One of the younger sons, drunk on champagne and entitlement, leaned too close, muttering that she was out of place here, that these halls were not built for her kind. And though his words were cloaked in a smile, she felt the venom burning beneath them. Across the room, the matriarch's cold eyes followed her every move. The same gaze HOA boards had used for decades to decide who was acceptable and who wasn't. The same gaze used to fine black families for having a lawn chair out of place while ignoring white neighbors with junk-filled driveways. The hypocrisy was suffocating, yet she remained composed. Her silence louder than their insults, her presence a defiance they couldn't comprehend. As the hours stretched on, the arrogance became bolder. The patriarch joked about charity cases while gesturing in her direction. One cousin sneered that she should be grateful just to be in the room, and when the deal was brought up, they spoke as if she were a junior partner rather than the woman holding the keys to their survival. Every word dripped with disdain. Every action a reminder of the systemic racism she had battled since childhood. From teachers who said college wasn't for girls like her to bankers who denied her loans, despite perfect credit. Yet this was not the same little girl who grew up watching her mother clean offices at night. This was a woman who had built her empire brick by brick, scar by scar, and with each insult, her resolve deepened. She thought of her ancestors, of her grandmother who picked cotton under the blazing sun, of her father who worked himself sick only to be denied recognition, of the countless black professionals who had been pushed aside while less qualified, white counterparts were lifted up. Their voices whispered within her, steady and strong, reminding her that tonight wasn't just about her, was about everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Still, the cruelty escalated. When dinner was served, they intentionally seated her at the far end of the table, a symbolic gesture of exclusion masked as logistics. And while their laughter filled the grand dining hall, she felt the familiar sting of being othered. Yet she also knew something they did not. The deal they so desperately wanted depended entirely on her signature. The irony was rich. This family that prided themselves on dominance, on control, on keeping black families out of their neighborhoods with HOA rules and racist fines, was now on their knees without even realizing it. And as she observed their smugness, the thin veil of civility that masked generations of prejudice, she realized that her choice would not only decide their future, but send a message far beyond these gilded walls. Each act of disdain piled higher, like kindling stacked for a fire they didn't know was about to consume them. And by the time the final insult was delivered, one of the daughters smirking that her people should be used to serving food, not eating at the table, The room had revealed itself in all its ugliness. Every ounce of their superiority exposed, every ounce of their cruelty laid bare. What they mistook as her silence was actually strategy. What they thought was weakness was strength coiled tight, and as they mocked, laughed, and dismissed her, she sat with the unshakable knowledge that the decision she would announce before the night was over would not only dismantle their empire but remind them, and anyone who had ever doubted her, that the days of bowing to prejudice were over. The room fell into a hush, not because they had offered respect, but because they sensed something shifting, the quiet before a storm none of them could control. As she set her glass down and finally met their eyes, one by one, stripping away their laughter, cutting through their arrogance, and making them squirm in a way no one ever had before. They had spent the entire evening mocking her presence, belittling her accomplishments, treating her like an unworthy guest in a space they believed was forever theirs. But now the tables had turned, and their smug confidence began to waver as she rose slowly from her chair, her calmness more terrifying than anger could ever be. She began to speak not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet power of someone carrying centuries of injustice on her shoulders, reminding them of every word, every slight, every act of prejudice they had unleashed that night. And though her voice was measured, the weight of it pressed against the opulent walls like thunder waiting to break. She told them of the countless HOA boards that had fined black families into bankruptcy while turning a blind eye to white violations, of the neighborhoods where children weren't allowed to play freely because property values mattered more than their laughter, of the boardrooms where she had been called lucky rather than skilled, an exception rather than deserving, and, as she spoke, their smiles froze, their glasses of champagne untouched, their certainty unraveling before their very eyes. The patriarch tried to interrupt, to reassert control with his booming voice, but she silenced him with nothing more than a steady gaze, a gaze that reminded him that, for all his money and privilege, he was powerless without her. The matriarch shifted uncomfortably, her mask of icy superiority cracking for the first time as she realized this woman was not a pawn in their game but the queen who had been playing them all along. And then she delivered the blow they never saw coming. The deal, the $5 billion salvation they had flaunted to their investors, bragged about to their peers, and depended upon to save their crumbling empire, was no longer theirs to claim. With deliberate precision, she revealed that she had been approached by other partners, ones who not only valued her innovation, but respected her humanity. And while this family laughed and mocked, those competitors had signed on the dotted line, sealing their fate before dessert had even been served. Gasps filled the room, forks clattered against plates, faces turned pale beneath the golden glow of chandeliers, and the power dynamic that had always favored them collapsed in an instant, leaving them exposed, desperate, and terrified. The younger son, who had slurred his racist venom earlier, slammed his fist against the table, but even his anger felt hollow, impotent against the tidal wave of reality crashing down upon them. She continued, her voice steady, reminding them that wealth without respect, legacy without justice, and power without integrity were nothing but illusions, fragile structures that collapsed when confronted with truth. Every word carved into them like stone, stripping away their entitlement, forcing them to see that the very person they tried to humiliate had just undone generations of privilege in a single evening. For the first time in their lives, they felt what so many black families had felt under their HOA boards, in their communities, in their workplaces, powerless, dismissed, treated as though they didn't belong in. The sting of that realization cut deeper than any fine, any insult, any exclusion. Silence stretched across the hall, heavy and suffocating, as she gathered her things, her composure unshaken, her dignity intact, leaving them in ruins not because she shouted or raged but because she refused to be broken, because she had chosen to stand taller than their hatred, and in doing so, dismantled the empire they believed untouchable. When she reached the door, she paused, turning back just once, her final words echoing like a verdict. The world was changing, and the future had no place for families who clung to the poison of racism. Then she left, her heels striking against the marble floor, like a drumbeat of justice, leaving behind not just a cancelled deal, but the ashes of their arrogance. The undeniable proof that the very thing they despised had been the force powerful enough to undo them. As she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the glittering chandeliers, the murmurs of panic, and the stunned silence of a once untouchable family, the weight of the evening did not press down on her. It lifted, as though centuries of unspoken injustice had finally been cracked open by her refusal to bend. And in that moment, she was not just one black woman standing against one white billionaire family, but the embodiment of resilience that had been passed down through generations, of those who were told they didn't belong, who were mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, yet who endured anyway. The news of the cancelled deal spread like wildfire, first whispered among investors, then splashed across business headlines. And with every article published, the family's empire crumbled a little more, exposing not just financial failure, but the rotten core of arrogance and prejudice that had long shielded them from accountability. In contrast, she was celebrated not as a token, not as an exception, but as a strategist, a visionary, and above all, a woman who demanded respect in spaces that had been built to exclude her, and the world took notice. Communities who had lived under the suffocating grip of HOA boards that punished black families for grass growing an inch too high while ignoring white neighbors' violations, saw her as proof that justice, though delayed, could still be delivered. Parents whispered her story to their children at night, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in dignity, showing them that when you stand tall in the face of hatred, you don't just win for yourself, you carve a path for those who will come after you. The billionaire family, once so proud of their influence, found themselves abandoned by allies, ridiculed by peers, and drowning in the very humiliation they had so eagerly tried to inflict upon her. And the irony was poetic. Their downfall, written not in rage, but in their own blindness. Yet, she did not linger on their destruction, for her victory was never about them. It was about reclaiming the space they had tried to deny her, proving that no amount of money or mockery could erase the worth of her humanity. Walking away from that night, she understood that racism was not defeated by a single confrontation, nor by one cancelled deal, but by each act of courage that chips away at the walls of hate, and her act had become a spark for countless others. Some would say she should have forgiven, others would argue she should have fought harder. But she knew that true power was not in fitting into their mold of respectability or in stooping to their level of cruelty. It was in standing unshaken, rooted in a dignity they could never touch. And so, her legacy was not just a headline or a viral story, but a reminder etched into the conscience of everyone who heard it. That racism festers not because it is strong, but because it is tolerated, and the moment it is met with unyielding truth, it begins to wither. For the family that lost billions, it was a lesson carved in financial ruin. For her, it was a triumph that transcended wealth. A reminder that the true measure of success is not what you own, but what you refuse to surrender your voice, your worth, your place in the world. And as the cameras turned to capture her rising star, as communities found hope in her courage, the story left behind a question that could not be ignored. How many more empires built on arrogance and hate will fall before we finally learn that dignity and equality are not privileges to be granted, but rights that can no longer be denied? As the headlines rolled across television screens and social media feeds, the story of the white billionaire family who mocked a black woman at their extravagant party only to lose a $5 billion deal became more than a cautionary tale. It became a mirror reflecting the arrogance, cruelty, and deeply embedded racism that still poisons the highest rungs of society. A reminder that wealth and status cannot shield anyone from the consequences of hate. For her, the night that had begun, with humiliation transformed into a moment of vindication, but she knew it was bigger than her. She carried the weight of ancestors who had been denied a seat at the table, of communities whose brilliance had been overshadowed by prejudice, of children growing up in neighborhoods still governed by HOA boards and systems designed to make them feel small, and she turned their scorn into a declaration that she belonged. not as a guest to be mocked, but as a force that could dismantle empires built on arrogance. The family's downfall was swift and public. Their partners fleeing, their empire crumbling. Their name tarnished not because of bad business, but because the world finally saw through the cracks of their superiority. And the very act of belittling her became the seed of their ruin. Yet, she did not let their collapse define her victory. For she understood that this was not just about punishing one racist family, but about shifting the narrative. Proving that dignity and resilience outlast mockery, and that true power is not measured in billions, but in the courage to walk away with your head high. Communities around the world took notice, inspired by her defiance. Parents teaching their children her story not as entertainment, but as a blueprint for resistance. A reminder that when confronted with injustice, silence is complicity and courage is contagious. And though the family's disgrace filled tabloids, her triumph was not in their ruin, but in the lives she touched. In the message, she spread that racism may still linger in boardrooms, gated communities, and glittering parties, but it can be dismantled by every act of unyielding truth. Even so, the deeper question remains: how many more families, corporations, or systems will need to be exposed before equality stops being a fight and becomes a reality? How many more people must endure mockery, exclusion, or disdain before society learns that worth cannot be measured by skin color, and humanity is not negotiable? That question lingers long after the cameras fade, pressing on the conscience of every viewer, demanding reflection. And so, if her story moved you, if it opened your eyes, or if it made you pause to consider how easily prejudice hides in plain sight, then let it not end here. Share this message. Add your voice to the fight, and ask yourself the hardest question of all. When the next act of injustice unfolds, will you stay silent, or will you stand? Because sometimes, the downfall of hate begins